Intuitively, most of us would assume that our mind exists within the brain, and what reason would we even have to assume otherwise, especially when we can learn about how our subjective experiences are correlated with all different types of brain processes. Before anyone understood the brain on a neurophysiological level, people felt unsure about where the mind might be located. Some people actually thought that the mind came from the heart. Other people thought that the mind took the form of a soul. But few people actually believed that the mind was correlated with the brain. That was until the Age of Enlightenment in the 18th and 19th centuries, when the mind being correlated with the brain became the common conception that we still have today. Modern neuroscience has taught us a lot about different areas of the brain that deeply tie in with the mind, for example, the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is actually hugely involved in our mental experiences, and it has two primary functions. One of them being the integration of sensory input and perceptions. So for example, it would take the sound, smell, temperature, and any other factors of rain and form them all into one cohesive experience of a rainy day. And the other function of the parietal lobe is the integration and the interpretation of sensory input, mainly to do with the visual field, to create a spatial coordinate system with which to represent the external world. Although it also has many other secondary functions, such as being involved in information processing, cognition, spatial orientation, coordination of movement, speech, reading, writing, and computation, just to name a few. So the parietal lobe is a prime brain region that is responsible for a lot of the workings of our mind. And it's knowledge like this, the discovery of which has led greatly to the belief that the mind exists within the brain, or that the mind even is the brain. We've all heard a bunch of times about how different experiences correlate with different brain areas, like how vision takes place in the occipital lobe, or reasoning taking place in the frontal cortex, to name some examples. But what actually causes the different brain areas to be able to process the different inputs? What is it that allows, for example, our occipital lobe to be able to process visual input, or our prefrontal cortex to allow us to do complex reasoning, or our amygdala to allow us to process emotions? And how do we actually distinguish the different parts of the brain? When looking at a human brain, it, for the most part, all sort of looks the same. Of course, the three primary brain areas look distinct: the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. But the distinctions between the different areas of, say, the cerebrum are largely indistinguishable to the untrained naked eye. Ever since the beginning of neuroscience, it's been difficult for scientists to organize the brain regions based on their experiential correlations. That is, what experiences correlate to the different brain regions, for example, sight for the visual cortex. However, even though it's still difficult, there has been significant progress being made in this area for over 100 years, which has led to a quickly growing number of human brain maps, which are otherwise known as atlases. Different brain atlases define the brain's regions with different methods. Some atlases define the brain's regions by their cellular structure, which is otherwise known as cytoarchitecture. Cytoarchitecture, or cell structure, varies across the brain, which allows us to create brain atlases based on cytoarchitecture. Other brain atlases define brain regions by seeing how artificial stimulation of the different areas of the brain affect those regions' functionality. But what is perhaps unsurprising, but still fascinating, is that there have been many studies showing that the difference in cytoarchitecture, or cell structure, across brain regions is closely correlated with the difference in the functionality of those same brain regions. That is to say, that if two brain regions have different cytoarchitecture, then you can also expect those brain regions to have different functionality. Defining the areas of the brain can be done with multiple different techniques, but in the early days of neuroscience, brain atlases were based on the locations of brain damage and how that damage would cause that brain area to function differently. The main strength of this approach is that it leads to causal observations. That is, that you can infer the function of a brain region by how damage to that region causes it to function differently. For example, there's a famous study from the 20th century with a patient who we know only by his initials HM. HM had some brain tissue cut out, mostly from his hippocampus, which caused him to be unable to form new memories, but he was still able to recall memories from before the procedure. This led to the inference that the hippocampus plays a crucial role in the acquisition of new memories. So the causal relationship between the removal of the brain tissue and HM's struggle forming new memories is a prime example of the strengths of this method of defining brain regions. Although one of the big downsides of this approach is that, for example, in instances where a lesion has been identified for the cause of a mental deficit, it's difficult or maybe even impossible to rule out other potential factors, such as strokes or cognitive impairments that could be playing a role in the mental deficit, or could even be the sole cause of the mental deficit. It could be possible that the memory loss in HM was caused by a stroke instead of the removal of brain tissue. Another approach to defining brain regions is to create temporary virtual lesions on the brains of healthy people. Brain functionality can be temporarily impaired by using techniques like transcranial magnetic stimulation or transcranial direct current stimulation. In fact, brain functionality can even be enhanced with these techniques. This virtual lesion method allows us to be more confident of the functions of the different areas of the brain as compared to studying real lesions on the brain. Yet another method to define brain regions is fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, where the fMRI machine produces magnetic fields and observes how they interact with the magnetic properties of atoms in the body to create detailed three-dimensional images of the structure of body parts, including the brain. This technique for imaging brain structures is popular for its high resolution. Typically, fMRI scans are done with a resolution of about 3 millimeters cubed, which means that each pixel covers about 3 millimeters of the brain surface. However, in this article in Nature, the engineers talk about their new MRI machine that can routinely scan a brain at a resolution of 0.35 to 0.45 millimeters. The final method of defining brain regions that I like to mention, which I brought up before, is the study of what's known as cytoarchitecture. Cytoarchitecture is the study of how the neurons in the brain and the nervous system are structured. When studying cytoarchitecture, the size and the shape of the neurons are considered, as well as the density of the packing of the neurons. There have been several studies showing that the differences in cytoarchitecture across the brain maps onto the differences in functionality across the brain as well. So if you identify two brain regions as having different functionality, you can also expect those brain regions to have different cytoarchitecture. This has been seen on human studies as well as studies on other primates. Although just because a brain region has a particular cellular structure doesn't actually mean that it can only ever perform one function. There have actually been animal experiments where sensory brain regions, so regions that are responsible for things like vision or smell or hearing, can actually take on the function of different senses, but only if the animal's brain is surgically rewired during the early stages of the animal's life. For example, scientists have connected the eyes of animals to their auditory cortexes so that instead of that brain region processing sound like it usually does, it then processed images instead. All because they connected the eyes to that brain region. Taken together, these methods, fMRI scanning, lesion studies, and cytoarchitecture, don't just show us which brain regions do what. They also reveal how unique patterns of cellular structure and neural signaling relate to specific functions. But understanding the functions of different areas of the brain, while still crucial, is still just too broad. Because we want to pinpoint the specific location of subjective experiences in the brain. And this is where the concept of the neural correlates of consciousness come in. The concept of the neural correlates of consciousness, which are otherwise known as NCCs, was first invented by Francis Crick and Christoph Koch, and they defined them as the minimal neural mechanisms that are together necessary and sufficient for experiencing any conscious percept. So a neural correlate of consciousness is the minimal set of neurons and neuronal activity that is required to have any mental experience. Particular cytoarchitecture, neuronal signaling, and brain oscillations are all relevant factors that go into any particular neural correlate of consciousness. A lot of neuroscientific work has been done in the pursuit of identifying some neural correlates of consciousness, and some NCCs have even been proposed, such as the neural correlate for memory. There has actually been some neurophysiological experiments on non-human primates, and even some neuroimaging studies on humans, that have proposed some neural correlates of working memory and of learning that are precise even down to single neurons. These experiments discovered that when a subject is remembering something, neurons in their parietal lobe continue to fire in a way that still represents the same stimuli that they once experienced in the external world. For example, if a woman that we'll call Jacqueline sees an apple, the neurons in her parietal lobe will activate in a certain way in response to her seeing the apple. And then whenever she remembers the apple, those same neurons will respond in a similar way as when she first saw the apple. When memory occurs, a particular type of neuron, called pyramidal neurons, form connections with each other that are excitatory, meaning that they encourage the receiving neuron to pass the message or signal forward to other neurons. These connections are also reciprocal, meaning the neurons can send signals back and forth to each other in a loop. Because of these excitatory and reciprocal connections, once a signal that's triggered by an external stimulus is introduced into the network, it can continue to reverberate or circulate among the connected neurons, even after the original stimulus is no longer there. This persistent activity of neuronal signals forms the basis of working memory and allows the brain to hold onto information temporarily. Despite the many proposed neural correlates of consciousness out there, there is still no generally agreed upon neuroscientific description of consciousness itself. Although the hope is that, as NCC research continues, whatever neural mechanisms that are relevant to consciousness as a whole will become clearer as the research advances over time. And that one day, scientists could eventually formulate theories to answer the hard questions of consciousness. However, the authors of this paper argue that despite all of the scientific investigation into NCCs, we still are no closer to being able to explain the subjective experiences of consciousness than we were before the study of NCCs began. And that's because the current most prominent method of discovering NCCs, called the contrastive method, only discovers the physical correlates of consciousness, but doesn't actually give an explanatory account of consciousness itself. NCCs correlate with mental experiences, however, they don't explain mental experiences. So it is, in principle, still possible that the neurons and neuronal signaling and whatever other physical constituents of the NCCs aren't actually sufficient to explain consciousness or even single mental experiences. It could be true that there's still something else undiscovered that we need if we want to explain consciousness or other mental experiences. It wasn't necessarily the intention of Francis Crick and Christoph Koch to definitively discover an explanation for consciousness when they proposed NCCs. They merely proposed NCCs in the pursuit of further narrowing down the study of consciousness in hopes that it may lead to the discovery of even just some direction towards being able to empirically research phenomenology itself. And there's still some uncertainty actually about whether NCCs give us a complete or even an adequate framework for exploring the neurophysiological correlations to mental experiences. Defining the minimal and necessary neurophysiology for a mental experience is just difficult. Things like neuroplasticity or even convergent evolution arguably make it really hard to support any claims about the minimal necessary neurophysiology for any given mental experience. The brain may be quite similar across people who have conventional neurophysiology, but that doesn't mean that the neurophysiology of the conventional human brain is the only structure that can support any given mental experience. Let's consider the brains of other creatures that presumably would have vastly different neurophysiology, but still seem to have the same mental experiences as us humans, such as octopuses, for example. Both octopuses and humans appear to experience the same sensation of pain, for example. And to strengthen the point of how dissimilar octopuses are from humans, it's worth mentioning that the last common ancestor of octopuses and humans lived 750 million years ago, whereas modern humans have only existed for the last approximately 250,000 years. So there might just not be any single necessary neural structure for any given mental experience. But perhaps it's actually not necessary for any given NCC to have the same structure across all brains. There isn't actually anything about the idea of NCCs that suggests that they must be structured in any specific way to give rise to any given mental experience. It may be the case that when, for example, both a human and an octopus have the same mental experience of pain, that both of their mental experiences may be correlated with radically different neural systems. The only issue with this though, if it turns out to be true, is that it'll make it so much harder to study NCCs. Because then, each individual's own unique NCCs would have to be identified first before they could be studied. However, this doesn't make any difference to the possibility that everyone might have their own unique NCCs, just in the same way that everyone has their own unique fingerprints. Even though there's still so much more to learn with regards to NCCs, we can already start to ask questions about what the discoveries in NCC research mean for the mind. Although, as we said earlier, NCCs don't give us an explanatory account of mental experiences, but they certainly do give us an account of correlation. And so we can consider the neural correlates of consciousness as, at least in part, the physical substrate of the mind. But can we actually move even further beyond identifying the NCCs as the correlative physical substrate of the mind? The general idea in NCC research seems to be that the mind and the brain are two distinct items. But what if the opposite of that is true? Could we maybe identify NCCs as the mind and the brain as one and the same thing? Could the neuroscientific theory of the neural correlates of consciousness be tied into the philosophical theory of mind-brain identity? The mind-brain identity theory proposes that mental states are actually the same thing as brain states and brain processes. That is to say that they are one and the same thing. Consider the mental experience of sight. The idea with mind-brain identity theory is that the mental process of sight is actually just the same thing as the brain process of sight. There is no distinction at all between the experience of sight and the brain mechanisms that give us sight. Or as we mentioned earlier with how memory is an excitatory and reciprocal neural process, mind-brain identity theory would say that memory is the same thing as that excitatory and reciprocal neural process. The authors of this somewhat popular philosophical paper believe that the mind-brain identity theory is the best theory for explaining the systematic mind-brain correlations. However, they admit that these mind-brain correlations still can't be taken to be direct proof that the mind-brain identity theory is true. So it seems like we could take NCCs to be the brain part of the mind-brain identity theory, while taking whatever correlated mental experience is to be the mind part of the theory. And so I believe that this basically covers the common conception that the mind exists within the brain. So all of this can be taken to be one potential explanation to the question of where is the mind located? And it's definitely the most intuitive answer, given that we see correlations between neural activity and mental experiences. However, due to the ongoing mysteries of the nature of the mind, there are actually some convincing arguments for externalist conceptions of the mind. That is, theories about the mind being partly located outside of the brain, in the external world. When we consider what's known as vehicle externalism, otherwise known as the extended mind, we can start to engage with the idea that some mental states may not be located entirely within the brain. Some mental states may literally be partly located outside of the brain. Vehicle externalism proposes that some mental states, like belief, or mental actions like believing, are literally constituted by factors external to the brain. That is to say that belief, or believing, are not only constituted by the relevant neuronal processes, but also by some relevant physical processes external to the brain. The mental state, in some cases, would be impossible without the external factors. So if a mental process like believing is constituted by factors external to the brain, then the mind must also exist partly outside of the brain, because believing is just one small part of the mind. In the paper The Extended Mind, Andy Clark and David Chalmers offer us a thought experiment that prompts us to consider a mental state that they propose exists partly outside of the brain. In this thought experiment, we consider the mental state of belief, the mental process of believing, and the mental action of memory. Imagine a woman whose name is Inga. Inga discovers that there is a modern art exhibition happening at the museum, and she decides that she'd like to go see it. She thinks for a second and remembers that the museum is located at 53rd Street, and then she walks to 53rd Street and visits the museum. It's uncontroversial to say that Inga knows, and so also believes, that the museum is on 53rd Street. Andy Clark and David Chalmers continue by saying, she believed this even before she consulted her memory. It was not previously an occurrent belief, but then neither are most of our beliefs. The belief was sitting somewhere in memory, waiting to be accessed. They mean that Inga's belief that the museum is on 53rd Street always exists, even when she's not thinking about it. It might sound unintuitive, but it's actually a well-established perspective about belief called a dispositional belief. Now, to continue this thought experiment, we'll consider the case of Otto. Otto has Alzheimer's disease, and so like many other people with Alzheimer's, Otto relies more so on information in his surrounding environment rather than from his memory to go about his life. Otto carries a notebook with him everywhere he goes, and when he wants to hold on to some new information, he'll just write it in his notebook. And when he needs to remember some old information, he'll just look in his notebook for it. Now, Otto also finds out about this modern art exhibition, and he decides that he'd like to see it as well. He looks into his notebook, and it says, Modern Art Exhibition at the museum on 53rd Street. So then after reading that, he goes to the museum and sees the art exhibition. Clark and Chalmers go on to say that Otto's notebook fulfills the function of memory for him, which is of course usually done in the brain. Clark and Chalmers also propose that the case of Inga's regular memory and Otto's notebook memory are entirely analogous in all ways that are relevant. Clark and Chalmers say that the notebook plays the same functional memorization role for Otto as Inga's brain does for her own memory. Otto uses his notebook to recall information all the time, and it also influences his actions in all different types of scenarios. Just in the same way that regular memory influences Inga's actions in other scenarios. Otto might retrieve the same piece of information over and over again from his notebook many times before he ultimately stops thinking about it and it disappears from his awareness, just in the same way as Inga would do with her regular memory. It seems incorrect to say that Otto's beliefs disappear when he puts his notebook away, just in the same way that it seems incorrect to say Inga's beliefs disappear when she just stops thinking about them. In their paper, Clark and Chalmers say, it seems reasonable to say that Otto believed the museum was on 53rd Street even before consulting his notebook. This actually makes sense because when we consider Inga's case of regular memory, She's not always thinking about how she believes that the museum is on 53rd Street, but even when she's not thinking about her beliefs, she nonetheless still believes them. And the same seems to be true for Otto. When he's not thinking about his beliefs, he still believes them. It's just that he needs to remember those beliefs by searching through the memories in his notebook instead of the memories in his brain. It's implied in this paper that Clark and Chalmers believe that the substrate of memory doesn't necessarily need to be a brain, but can be anything that fulfills the functional role of memory, which they propose that Otto's notebook does. Of course, the way in which they remember is different. Inga uses her brain and Otto uses a notebook, but they both lead to the same result of the mental action of remembering some information. The idea with this thought experiment is that Otto's notebook functions as a sort of external memory bank for Otto. Clark and Chalmers, in their final paragraph of their paper, under the section titled From Cognition to Mind, say that any reluctance to the idea that the notebook is a genuine external component of Otto's mind may come from a residual feeling that the only true beliefs are recurrent beliefs, which they say would be an extreme view and would also rule out Inga's belief that the museum is on 53rd Street. This is because, for Inga and Otto, the belief that the museum is on 53rd Street is only sometimes an occurrent belief. Most of the time, it's a dispositional belief. Most of the time, Inga and Otto are not thinking about how they believe that the museum is on 53rd Street. The belief is stored away in memory, or for Otto, stored away in his notebook. The belief is still existing, but not in active thought, though always ready to be accessed and brought to the front of thought whenever necessary. Only when they are thinking about how the museum is on 53rd Street does the belief become an occurrent belief, because the belief is occurring in the present moment. So once we adopt a much more common view and allow for dispositional beliefs to be considered, then Clark and Chalmers say that it's difficult to rebut the conclusion that Otto's notebook really is an external part of his mind. With this extended mind idea, we can sometimes identify objects in the world as being part of our cognitive processes, like Otto's notebook allowing him to remember things. But we could actually go even further with this whole idea of the mind existing outside of the brain. What if, instead of just a notebook being part of the mind, the entire external world was part of the mind? This is one core feature of the mind-object identity theory. Earlier we mentioned the mind-brain identity theory, where the idea is that particular neural processes are not just correlated with mental experiences, but are actually one and the same thing as mental experiences. But mind-object identity theory, invented by Riccardo Manzotti, though much newer and more fringe, is similar to mind-brain identity theory in the regard that, as the name suggests, it identifies the mind as one and the same as physical objects or events in the external world. Any real physical thing that you see is identified as part of the mind. See, Riccardo Manzotti says that one of the problems with mind-brain identity theory is that any of the proposed neural systems or neural events don't have any of the same properties as conscious experiences do. This is something that Manzotti addresses in his paper and is one of the key points of the so-called hard problem of consciousness. The problem is that when we look at neural systems, there's nothing there that we can point at and say, oh, there it is, that's consciousness. There always seems to be some missing link between our brain to the experience of consciousness. Riccardo Manzotti, in his paper, says, I will maintain that the biggest shortcoming of identity theories is of empirical nature. Brain processes do not have the properties that consciousness has. But Riccardo Manzotti addresses this disconnect that appears in mind-brain identity theory. In his mind-object identity theory, he suggests that when we experience an object in the external world, our experience of it is actually identical to the object itself. Our experience of the object and the object itself is one and the same thing. This addresses the issue in mind-brain identity theory, where there is a disconnect between the properties of neural systems and the properties of mental experiences. The question of how do we get from physical processes to mental experiences? Because if our experiences are just the same thing as the objects we're experiencing, then we can just remove the middle step between brain processes to conscious experiences. Manzotti gives us a thought experiment that goes like this. Jacqueline is perceiving an apple in front of her. Now think about Jacqueline's experience of the apple. What is her experience made of? And where is her experience? Riccardo says that the traditional mind-brain identity theorists locate her experiences of the apple in her brain, but nothing inside her brain has the same properties that the apple does. Jacqueline experiences a red, round, shiny apple, but nothing in her brain is red, round, or shiny. This is a reason he gives for why he believes that mind-brain identity can't work. This is where Manzotti proposes to identify Jacqueline's experience with something different from her neural processes. He proposes to identify her experience of the apple as the apple itself. Under Manzotti's theory, Jacqueline's experience of the apple is the same thing as the apple itself. And in fact, our experience of any object is the same thing as the object itself. One's experience is not located inside the brain. It is the very object one experiences. Consciousness is literally outside the head. This proposal simplifies how we understand consciousness. Under this theory, Manzotti says, there are no more metaphysical mysteries, no mystery of how neurons create experience, and no mystery of what experience is or where it's located. One potential argument that Manzotti addresses in his text is regarding what's known as subjective variability. Subjective variability refers to when multiple people experience the same object but in different ways. To give an example, Jacqueline sees the apple as being red, but a colorblind person might see the apple as being grey. But if they both have different experiences of the same apple, then how could their experiences of it possibly be identical with the apple itself? The apple itself can't be red and grey at the same time. Manzotti refers to this phenomenon as object relativity. Since the perception of the apple depends on the unique physiology of each person's eyes, then because the physiology varies, then so does the perception of the apple. A difference in the physiology of Jacqueline's eyes and the colorblind person's eyes causes a difference in the properties of the apple to each individual. Hence, object relativity, or another term that Manzotti uses here is relative properties. In a person with regularly functioning eyes, the color receptive cells will be responsible for a person experiencing the apple as red. In a person with achromatopsia though, their color receptive cells just aren't active, so they'll experience the apple as grey. And so Manzotti explains that even though Jacqueline's and the colorblind person's experiences of the apple are different from each other, both of their experiences are still identical with the apple itself. In this scenario, with Jacqueline and the colorblind person, we can think of their eyes as the machines that decode the information from the apple. Jacqueline's eyes will decode the information differently from the colorblind person's eyes, but they're still perceiving the same apple. It's just a different form of perception, or a different form of decoding. Just because our experience of the apple can drastically vary from person to person, still doesn't mean that our experience isn't identical with the apple itself. It only means that the properties of the apple are relative to each person depending on their own unique physiology. Our experience of the apple is just an abstraction of how the apple exists in objective reality. But that does not necessitate that experience must be separate from the apple itself. It only means that our bodies interpret sense data differently depending on how the apple interacts with our own unique physiology. Object relativity explains away subjective variability. The short answer is that since the object's properties are relative to our bodies, each difference in our body will determine a difference in the properties of the object. You may think that there would be scenarios where two people experience the same object differently and that their difference wouldn't be explainable with object relativity or relative properties. Manzotti mentions this, saying that there are too many relative properties to address all of them. But he asserts that it is equally as possible to explain any scenario where there is variation in individual perception with relative properties. But if this theory is correct, and external objects really are one and the same as our mental experiences, then how does it explain things that we can imagine but have never seen before, like a pink elephant? If the mind just is the external world, then how can we imagine a pink elephant when we have never seen one in the external world before? Well, according to Manzotti, we don't need to see a pink elephant to be able to imagine one. If we dream of a pink elephant, according to Manzotti, when we dream or imagine or even hallucinate something unique like a pink elephant, it's simply just a recombination of things that we have previously seen in the real world. In fact, Manzotti addresses any ideas that we can experience something truly new in our dreams. Our dreams are populated by the same colors, tastes, smells, shapes, sounds, and properties that we encounter around the clock. And so everything we experience in our dreams is just recombinations of things that we experience in waking life. He says that it's actually entirely impossible for us to imagine anything truly new. Even if we imagine or dream something that's unique to what we've experienced in waking life, it's still always just a recombination of multiple different things that we've experienced in waking life. Speaking about imagination, dreams, hallucinations, and memories, how do all of these things actually fit into Manzotti's mind-object identity? If our mind is the same thing as external objects, then how does this theory explain things like memories or dreams? So far we've seen how Manzotti has explained that everything in our imagination is just reconstructions of things that we have seen in the external world. But how does the imagination exist as part of the mind if the mind is just the external world? We don't directly see our imagination or dreams as external objects, so how does his theory explain them? Manzotti addresses this issue by saying that we have to reconsider our notion of now, the present. Manzotti mentions the fact that during any perceptual experience, there is always some time gap between what is happening and our experience of what is happening. The time gap is often minuscule, but even still, there is always a time gap. When Jacqueline sees the apple, it takes a very brief moment for the light to travel from the apple to Jacqueline's eyes. And it also takes a brief moment for Jacqueline's brain to do the neural processing that allows her to have the experience of the apple. It's a scientific fact that anything that happens in the external world happens slightly earlier than when we perceive it. Manzotti gives the example of trying to catch a fly. The reason it's so difficult to catch a fly is because our brain's processing is literally too slow to be able to catch them. We literally experience the external world with a slight time delay. This phenomenon is known as perceptual latency, and the minimum perceptual latency for a human is 13 milliseconds. To mention a slightly different case, Manzotti mentions how when we look at stars at nighttime, they are light years away. So on top of the perceptual latency, there is also a large physical latency with how long it takes for the light to travel to Earth. Manzotti says that we are mistaken when we believe that an external event happens at the same time as when we perceive it, even if it's only a difference of a few milliseconds. Our perception of the external world is always slightly behind what is actually happening in the external world. Everything we perceive is to some extent in the past. The present is not what takes place at a given time, but rather is the set of events that causes neural activity at a given time. Manzotti says that when we dream about or remember something like an apple, for example, we first need to experience that apple in the real world before we can dream about or remember it. From here, he says that dreaming about or remembering the apple is just the same as the fly that we're unable to catch or the star that's light years away. Because when we experience a memory, the content of that memory is about something that really was in the external world once. Just in the same way as when you try to catch a fly, you're trying to catch a fly that really was there once only a few hundred milliseconds ago, but now has moved to a different location. And Manzotti says that the contents of our dreams or memories, which could be the fly or the apple for example, are still causally active to our brains. External objects are causally active to us when they are right in front of us, and similarly, they are also causally active to us in memories or dreams. The experiences of seeing the apple right in front of us and seeing the apple in memory are both experiences of the same object. Even when the apple is no longer in front of us, it's still having a causal influence on us when we dream or remember it. The only difference is that there is different neural signaling that takes place when you see the apple directly in front of you compared to when you remember or dream about it. When you're seeing a fly buzzing around in front of you, the actual event of that fly being in some precise location is actually in the past of when you experience that fly being in that precise location. Just in the same way that the actual event of Jacqueline holding the apple is in the past of your memory of Jacqueline holding the apple. Even though the fly scenario seems to take place in the present, there is still an incongruence of when the event actually happens and when you experience it. Just in the same way as how there's an incongruence between Jacqueline actually holding the apple and when you remember Jacqueline holding the apple. The only difference is that the incongruence in time is much more brief in the fly scenario than it is in the apple scenario. Of course, by the time you're remembering the apple, that same apple is now in a different state, perhaps dissolved in Jacqueline's stomach acid. But the memory you're having of the apple is still identical to the apple as it really was at the time when Jacqueline was holding it. Manzotti says that when we have memories, dreams, etc., that the content of those memories and dreams is still causally active to us. That is, still affecting us in some way, just like the fly is. It makes sense when you consider it from a neurophysiological perspective. Vision is dependent on an intricate system of electrical and chemical signals, and memory is also just dependent on an intricate system of electrical and chemical signals. So when the apple is having a causal influence on us, it's either causing an electric and chemical response for us to see it in the external world, or it's causing an electric and chemical response for us to see it in our memory. In both circumstances, the apple is just causing an electrical and chemical signal in us. This same logic applies to dreams, hallucinations, and imagination as well. That is an overview of some of Riccardo Manzotti's mind-object identity theory. I know it's quite tricky to wrap your head around and conceptually quite different to other conceptions of the mind, but if Manzotti's theory, which I personally find quite compelling, is correct, then that would mean that the location of the mind is literally outside of the brain, which is quite fascinating because Manzotti's theory has no inklings of unscientificness at all. Not only that, but it's strictly physicalist as well, meaning that it works without the addition of some hypothetical substance or properties to constitute the mind. Manzotti's theory fits entirely within our world as we know it today. If you want to learn more about Manzotti's theory, like how he addresses intentionality or phenomenal character, or if you just want a deeper understanding of his theory in general, you can find the link to his paper in the description of this video, along with all the other sources I use for the research of this video.